Hey, thank you for taking the time to join us for our fifth episode in the Problematic Bible Verses series. Now, if you haven't been with us from the beginning, let me just take a minute and encourage you to go back and maybe check out the previous four episodes. By doing that, you might be able to get kind of a feel for some of the passages that we've already tackled and the approach that we take as we deal with some of the difficult texts. But tonight, I want to focus on a particular verse that I feel like I've been seeing weaponized more and more over the last few years. A verse that honestly, on the surface, much like the other ones that we've already covered, sounds pretty horrible when you first read it. And because of that, this passage gets thrown around time and time again as supposed proof that the Bible is immoral, that it's outdated, and that it even supported physical abuse. So tonight, instead of dodging the question and dodging the text and pretending that it doesn't exist at all, we're going to do what we always do in this series. We're going to slow down. We're going to look at the context. We're going to examine the language, and we're going to ask what the text actually meant in the world where it was written. Now, with that said, I want to start with asking a question that I know is on everybody's mind and the reason that you probably clicked on the video. So let's not waste any time digging into it. Did the Bible really allow a father to sell his own daughter into slavery? And did the Bible approve of it? Because that's the claim that's been heard loud and clear for years and years. That's what you'll hear over and over again from skeptics who try to discredit the Bible and show that God is immoral. You'll hear claims like Exodus 21:7 proves that the Bible is immoral. Or Exodus 21 shows us that God endorses human trafficking, or even that a father could just sell his daughter outright for profit. And look, if we're being honest, when we actually sit down and read the verse in isolation, it does actually sound like that. So let's look at the verse together, but let's also examine the text surrounding the verse. Rather than dodging it completely because we want to avoid it, let's actually read it and see what it has to say. If we look at Exodus 21:7, in the ESV, it reads, "When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do." Now, if you stop right there, it actually raises a lot of questions. Questions like, why the heck does this sound like this is a normal thing? A father selling his daughter as a slave. Why is she being sold? And why is she being treated differently than male servants? So today, the goal is to slow this down, to check it out and actually look at it honestly. What we're not going to do is just blindly defend it or ignore the tension surrounding it. Because the truth is, you can't really understand something if you're always trying to cover it up or run away from it. See, here's the reality. If you rip a verse out of its historical, cultural, and economic context, then you will most assuredly misunderstand it. Now, let's be fair for a second and state the claim loud and clear that's usually made. The claim usually goes something like this. The Bible allows fathers to sell their daughters into slavery, man, and for their own personal gain. That's immoral, that's exploitation, and that's human trafficking. Now, if that's actually what we did find in the text, then yeah, I would agree that's pretty problematic. But the real question becomes, is that really what's happening? Is that what this command is actually describing? Or are we reading an ancient system through our own modern lens? So before we go any further, let's take a look at how this argument is typically framed, how it's typically handled by skeptics so that we can better understand the claim that they're trying to make.
Is there any reason that you can think of that people should child traffic?
No, I would say no.
Exodus 21:7. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. Do you have a sister?
I do not.
Cousin, female cousins, or
I do. I have one who's very close to me.
Would it be okay for your uncle to sell your favorite cousin as a slave?
No.
Okay, so that would be child trafficking. Is it ever good to sell your daughter as a slave?
No.
Can you think of any situation where that's a good thing?
No.
All right, let's turn to Exodus 21, verse 7. And then, before we read it, one other question. Is even permitting selling daughters as slaves, is that good?
No. I mean, no one permits people to sell their daughters as slaves. I mean, permitting, it's just, that's that person's choice. The store isn't permitting you to steal, but they're not locking the door. And
would you say then that God permitted the selling of daughters as slaves when you read this?
No.
You wouldn't say that?
No.
Why not?
All right, so starting off, before we even get into this verse, we need to ask a very serious and very important question. What kind of slavery are we actually talking about? Because here's the issue. The second that we hear that word in our modern world and our modern culture, our minds typically go to one thing. We think of race-based slavery. We think of forced labor. We think of abuse, ownership, no rights, no autonomy, and no way out. That's usually our frame of reference. But there's a big problem with that. And I'm not going to lie. This is the part where skeptics will immediately jump in and they'll say things like, oh, so now you're going to tell me in what context slavery is okay. Trust me, I've heard that argument a million times. Now, that question, even though it sounds pretty powerful, is actually missing something really important on purpose. And we've already talked about this in a lot of our past episodes. Context determines what a word means, not the other way around. You don't take the modern definition of a word and force it backwards into an ancient text. You start with the world where the text came from, and then you work forward. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start by evaluating the textual evidence. And if you've been watching any of the previous videos, then you already know where this is going. We're going to first establish the textual evidence, then the historical evidence, then the scholarly evidence, and finally, the cultural evidence. Because if we can build a foundation on these 4 pillars, then we have a much more stable structure than someone who's building it on sand or conjecture. So what we're actually going to do is look at the verse in question, and we're going to focus on the word slave. And we're going to find out a little bit about the Hebrew word that's being used here. Now, if we go to HALOT, the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, like we typically like to do for this kind of thing, we find that the Hebrew word is ʻāmâ, and it actually carries the meaning of a female servant or a maidservant. Now, you can interchange the word servant with slave. That's perfectly fine. It doesn't change anything that we're going to talk about. Now, ironically, this is the exact same word that's used in a story that we find in the book of Ruth, chapter 3. So let's go over there first, and we're going to see how that story unfolds, starting in verse 7. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she, Ruth, came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant," or your ʻāmâ. "Spread your wings over your ʻāmâ, for you are a redeemer." And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman." So here it's actually extremely clear, very clear, crystal clear, that this term ʻāmâ that we find interpreted as slave in Exodus 21:7 is not a term that's being used to describe some kind of property or a position of abuse. We know this because Ruth, completely of her own free will and her own volition, chooses to seek out Boaz and willingly refers to herself as his ʻāmâ. And we can get even more confirmation from this by looking at Boaz's response. He doesn't recoil in horror. He doesn't act like Ruth is crazy or that she's degrading herself. And he doesn't treat her like an object. In fact, he does the complete opposite. He actually responds by blessing her, and he praises her character and calls her a worthy woman. And he even goes far as to commend her for what she's asking. Now, why? See, that alone should immediately force somebody to ask an important question. If the word ʻāmâ really meant what skeptics claim it means, this harsh, abusive concept of slavery, then why would Ruth willingly be placing herself in this position? Why would she be actively seeking it out? Why, in the very same breath that she asks Boaz to spread his wings over her in protection and covenant care, would she supposedly be asking for him to abuse her and own her as property? And lastly, why the heck would Boaz praise her and call her a worthy woman in the process? It would make no sense at all. And that's why the answer is pretty obvious, because that's not what the word is describing. Ruth is approaching Boaz within the context of covenant protection. She's asking for provision, for household security, and ultimately marriage redemption. She's asking to come under his care as a redeemer. And Boaz actually sees it as an act of faithfulness and virtue, not self-degradation. See, the term ʻāmâ actually carries a much broader household and relational meaning than skeptics often allow for. But many critics don't want to wrestle with that broader context because instead they like to approach the text through a modern, predetermined lens and then force the ancient world to fit into it. Now look, I get it. This next part is going to be very uncomfortable. And that's because we're going to be talking about a system that our culture today would immediately push back on. It's something that we would look at today and we'd probably say that kind of feels unjust, or that kind of feels wrong. And I'm going to acknowledge that up front. We're not going to shy away from that. This isn't an easy topic to talk about or an easy topic to cover. But just because something isn't all rainbows and unicorns, or just because a cultural practice doesn't line up with what we're personally used to or what we personally accept, that doesn't automatically make it immoral. Because look, we have to acknowledge and we have to be honest that other cultures have existed throughout human history, other cultures besides our own, and other economies within those cultures functioned very differently than our systems do. And to say that the only acceptable systems are the ones that we currently approve of, well, that's just, I'm going to be honest, that's not a fair way to evaluate history. We are not the final moral standard of humanity. And frankly, I think it's really, really ignorant to pretend that we should have the final say in how moral or immoral anything is that anybody does, especially when we're choosing to ignore the context around that something and just inspect it and judge it from a distance and from our own biased, predetermined, ignorant standards. In fact, 150 years from now, I can almost guarantee you that people will no doubt look back on our culture and our time, and they're going to find some things that we feel are perfectly moral and just as extremely problematic. But that doesn't mean that everything that we're doing right now is immoral. And it certainly doesn't make it a problem within our current culture and the current systems that we have in place that govern our society. It only becomes an issue when you take a future standard, one that doesn't even exist yet, and try to force it backwards onto a culture that was never expected or never intended to function within those confines. And then what's worse, you expect everyone and everything to conform themselves to it. So when we come back to Exodus 21, we have to be willing to be honest about a lot of things. And one of those things is that even though skeptics hate admitting it or hate conceding the point, the system that's being described within Exodus 21:7 is not the same system that we picture when we hear the word slavery. Now, if we don't take the time to actually separate those two ideas, then we're already starting off on the wrong foot. And even worse, we risk being completely disingenuous to the actual historical and cultural reality. And we do it just so we can hold on to a conclusion that we've already predetermined is right. A conclusion that, by the way, insists that we willfully choose to completely ignore the historical and cultural framework surrounding it. So here's my question. Does that sound more like intellectual processing, or does it sound more like indoctrination? Does it sound more like, as some would say, following the data or following the dogma? See, in the ancient world, a lot of the times, especially in Israel, what's often translated as slavery was much closer to debt servitude. And we have multiple older videos going into deep discussions about this. But scholars point this out pretty consistently. It's not a new concept. For example, John Walton, who specializes in ancient Near Eastern culture, explains that this system functioned as a way for people to survive economically in a world with no safety nets. He writes, in the ancient world, there were no bankruptcy laws, no social services, no homeless shelters, and no welfare programs. People who fell into debt had few options other than to enter servitude in order to survive. There were no banks, no loans, no government assistance programs. So if someone fell into poverty, they weren't just able to go to their local office and get assistance to help them pay their bills or to help them buy groceries to support their family. They didn't have the internet. They couldn't just hop on their phone or hop on the computer and open up a credit card so they could charge a few things to it to survive. They had one choice and one choice only. Find a wealthier household that needed help running that household and ask to join it. See, in that time, wealth was established and gauged by two metrics, and that was how much land you owned and how much livestock you owned. The more land that you owned, the wealthier that you were. The more livestock that you owned, the wealthier you were. And that meant that the wealthier the household was, and the more that they owned, the more hands would be needed to help plant crops and tend to the livestock. And as part of that household, your responsibility was to help support it and help it to provide more income and increase its wealth. And in return, you got provided for. You got food, you got shelter, you got comfort, you got protection, and you essentially got a new family. So right away, we're not talking about somebody who's being kidnapped, sold, abused, but that's unfortunately usually the way that skeptics try to paint the picture. because that's the only view that allows their predetermined narrative and their predetermined conclusion to have a foundation to rest on. Once you start actually looking at things from a historical and cultural perspective instead of your own predetermined bias, then that foundation starts eroding faster than a sandcastle at high tide. See, what we're actually talking about, if we're going to be completely honest, is someone who's being placed into a system that's meant to offer provision, not exploitation. Now let's pack that concept up and we're going to bring it back to verse 7. Because the next word that usually trips people up is the word sell. And look, that word hits hard too. I'm not denying that. Because in our current culture, in our current frame of mind, what typically comes to mind when we hear that word is something along the lines of, look, I'm selling my daughter to you, so she's your property. You can do whatever you want with her. You can use her. You can abuse her. She's now yours. But in the context that we just laid out, that's not what's happening at all. What we just previously described is much closer to a contractual agreement where a daughter is being placed into another household, very often with marriage as the main focal point. And this isn't just a outrageous or a lucky guess. Scholars like Raymond Westbrook, who studied ancient Near Eastern law pretty extensively, points out that these kind of arrangements were almost exclusively tied to marriage agreements, bride price systems, or long-term provision contracts. He writes, the sale of a daughter was normally intended as a marriage arrangement, whereby the girl entered the household of her future husband or her father-in-law. So instead of thinking about something along the lines of the father profits off of the daughter, what we should actually be thinking is something along the lines of the father secures the daughter's future within a stable household. And that's extremely important because it paints a completely different picture than the one that skeptics are constantly trying to paint. It turns the image of the authority figure from a monster to a caring father. Now, I know what a lot of people are thinking at this point. Yeah, okay, but why would a father even do that? And that's a fair question, but I think we've already started to answer that. Again, we have to step out of our world for a second, our cultural lens. We have to look at the ancient world. Like I just mentioned, in our current culture, if a family is struggling financially, then they have multiple options available to them. They can get assistance, they can take out a loan, they can find programs to help. But back then, none of that existed. If you weren't born into a wealthy family, then your chances of survival were drastically reduced the second you were born. Families faced very real and very immediate danger that often brought along with it very difficult decisions that had to be made. Many fathers faced a difficult choice. Do I keep my daughter here with me where I know that I may not be able to provide for her, knowing that our family is already struggling to financially support ourselves and take care of our own basic needs like food, water, and shelter, and risk the worst possible scenario that my daughter actually dies because I can't provide her with these things? Or do I place her within a wealthier household that actually does have the ability to provide her with these things? And in that ancient world, this was often the best available option. It wasn't a great option. Now, I think we can all acknowledge that it wasn't an ideal situation. No father wants to give up his daughter to another household. But what we're talking about is not ideal situations. We're talking about survival. We're talking about the difference between life or death. And again, in that culture, in that current framework, the father wasn't doing anything immoral in his own eyes, nor was he doing anything immoral in the eyes of anyone looking in or looking from the outside in on that situation. He was simply securing his daughter's survival to the best of his ability with the limited resources and limited options that he had to work with. And it's also equally important to recognize that the household purchasing her wasn't doing anything immoral either. They weren't viewed by outsiders as exploitators or slave owners. They were seen as providing stability to a broken situation. They were seen as bringing a girl into their home and taking on the responsibility for her well-being. Now, I'm not negating that our current culture probably has a really hard time accepting that. But if we're going to be honest with the text, then we need to be willing to understand it on its own terms and listen to what it's trying to say. We can't just force our own terms into the text in an effort to make it say what we want to say, like taking a square peg and trying to force it into a round hole. Now, this is where I want to take a minute and mention something else that I think is pretty important, because a lot of people make the assumption that this is a system that God is creating. that he's instituting it with commands and orders. But that's not what's happening at all. God is stepping into a system that already exists, a broken system that people are already living out in reality, and he's putting guardrails, safety nets, and boundaries around it. Christopher J.H. Wright puts it this way: the law did not create slavery in Israel. It found it existing and sought to regulate it in such a way as to preserve the dignity and rights of those who are vulnerable to exploitation. So if you haven't guessed by now, here's the part that for some reason always gets left out when skeptics bring up Exodus 21:7. I'll give you a hint. It's the same issue that we've talked about with all the other previous episodes. They stop at verse 7. They isolate a single verse, then they rip it out of its cultural and textual context, and they pretend like they've found this smoking gun that shows that the Bible is immoral. But all they've really succeeded at proving is their own ignorance and bias, because the law doesn't stop at verse 7. It keeps going. But getting a full picture of the law and including the context surrounding it would completely dismantle their claim. So they need to stop at verse 7. So what we're going to do is keep reading, because ignoring something doesn't solve any problems. It actually creates even more. And something I've learned from years of doing this is that the truth never is afraid of being discovered. So what we actually see come next changes everything. If we read verse 8, we start to get the rest of the story. If she does not please her master, who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. So right on the heels of verse 7, we actually read something very interesting that is usually overlooked or ignored. The daughter is not trapped in a hopeless situation, nor is she owned as a piece of property. If the arrangement for some reason doesn't pan out, then she has a way out. Her family has the right to redeem her and bring her back to their household. But then it says something even more important and quite frankly shocking for anyone who knows how little care was shown for women in the surrounding nations and cultures. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has broken faith with her. Now that's huge. Why? Because the implications are extremely clear. She can't be trafficked. She can't be sold to someone else. She can't be exploited. You can't just simply pass her around like a piece of property. She has value, she has dignity, she has worth, and she has rights. That was completely unheard of at a time where women in the surrounding nations and cultures were allowed to be freely used and abused. Women in surrounding cultures and nations typically had no rights at all. But there's something else that I think is really important to notice within the text. Notice how the verse puts the emphasis on the man who is the one at fault within the situation. If the relationship fails and she doesn't please him, then the verse makes a very clear point of saying that he is the one who has broken faith with her, not the other way around. Now that sounds kind of weird for a woman who apparently has no rights and is just a piece of property. This is putting all the responsibility and all the restriction on the man's role within the relationship, while simultaneously granting the woman rights and removing limitations for her. Moving on to verse 9. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as with a daughter. So if he doesn't want to marry her, he can give her to his son to marry. But did you actually catch what the verse said? She's not to be treated as a servant or a slave. She's to be treated as a daughter. Once again, the scripture is elevating her status, not diminishing it. It's granting her legal rights as a daughter to the household that she would have never had access to within any other culture or nation. Then we get to verse 10. If he takes another wife, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. Now this one here, this is massive, because in surrounding nations and cultures, a woman in this position could be just easily replaced and ignored. You wanted another wife because you didn't like the one you had? No problem. Just abandon her and pick up a new one. But here, within Israel, within the covenant code, God issues an unequivocal no. You do not get to neglect her. You do not get to reduce her provisions, and you don't get to just push her aside like she doesn't matter anymore. She has value, she has worth, and she has dignity and rights. And then verse 11 just brings it home. If he does not do these three things for her, she shall go out for nothing, without payment of money. In other words, if the man fails at his responsibilities and at providing the things that he's responsible for providing her for, and if he doesn't uphold his obligation, then she walks free. Period. no questions asked. She or her family owe him no debt, there's no penalty, and there's no strings attached. She's free. She is a free woman and free of the relationship. Once again, we're back to putting all the responsibility and all the limitations on the man, not the woman. In fact, the woman actually has her rights liberated while the man's rights are limited. Now, again, that would be a pretty weird situation to find yourself in if you're a woman who's been purchased by a man and he can do whatever he wants with you because you're his property and you're his slave. So let's just take a minute. Let's step back from the text. Let's look at some of the things that we've covered, some of the things that we've read. And now that we've read the full passage and not just a little teeny tiny portion of it that sounds like a really good soundbite, I would pose the question, does this to you sound like a system that was designed to exploit and abuse women? Or does it sound like a system that was probably designed more to be a provision for her and to protect her in a world where she would otherwise be extremely vulnerable? So now we come back to the original claim. Is the father selling his daughter as a slave for profit? No, that's absolutely not what the text is describing. In fact, the only way to arrive at that conclusion is to ignore every scrap of textual evidence, historical evidence, scholarly evidence, and cultural evidence. What is being described is a father's very difficult decision in a very difficult world, in a very difficult situation, to secure his daughter's well-being and long-term care. A decision that's admittedly less than ideal, but unfortunately was a stark reality within that cultural time. And it also describes God stepping into that reality and saying, if this is going to happen, if this is going to be a possibility, then here's the rules. You're not allowed to abuse her. You're not allowed to just discard her. You're not allowed to neglect her. And you're not allowed to treat her like a piece of property. You must provide for her, care for her, protect her, and treat her with dignity. Now, does that make it feel any more normal to us? No, but it quite frankly shouldn't, because we're not living in that world. But that's the point. That's the part that causes the friction, in my opinion. Too many times Christians try to paint this scenario as an amazing experience. Like it's all unicorns and rainbows. You can tell I like that phrase. But it's not. This was a horrible position to find yourself in as a father. Nobody looked forward to selling their daughter into another household just so they could provide her basic needs. But the Bible never tries to pretend like the world is perfect or was perfect. It's addressing the reality of a really horrible situation within a broken system and putting guardrails around it and protections on it that protect the most vulnerable within it. It's elevating the dignity and the worth of the woman's life above what any other culture or nation in that time period was willing to acknowledge. So let's bring it forward for one final analogy. Let me give you a quick way to think about this. Imagine a world that has no safety nets, no welfare system, no bank institutions, no legal protections. And then we have a family that falls into extreme poverty. Now, a father has two choices. One, he can keep his daughter with him and risk not being able to provide her basic needs. Or worst case scenario, risk her dying because he can't provide her with those basic needs. Or number two, he can choose to place her within a household that can guarantee those things, that can guarantee that she will be fed, that she'll be clothed, and that she will be protected. In our world, we'd likely and reasonably say, man, there's got to be a better option. But in their ancient world, there wasn't one. This was the option, death or security. And what God does is make sure that that option doesn't turn into exploitation. So when skeptics point to Exodus 21:7 and they say things like, this proves that God is immoral. Look, he's perfectly fine with human trafficking. He's fine with a guy selling his own daughter into slavery. What they're usually doing is just reading a single verse through their own modern lens and choosing to intentionally ignore the surrounding context. Because when you do that, it allows you to hold on to your predetermined bias, your predetermined narrative without encountering any kind of physical resistance. It allows you to build your foundation out of sand and then step back and marvel at it and be like, man, that looks so good, while you completely ignore the waves that are lapping up closer and closer because high tide is coming in. And most importantly, what it allows you to do is make almost anything sound worse than it really actually was. But if you slow it down and you actually look at the full passage, when you choose to actually look into the context surrounding the culture and the economic systems in place at that time, then you start to see something a little bit different. You see a God who doesn't endorse exploitation, but rather a God who's limiting it as much as he possibly can. You see a system that's not designed to harm the innocent and vulnerable, but a system that's meant to restrain harm and actually protect the innocent and the vulnerable. And that ultimately matters because it actually gives us a really good glimpse into how God works. It shows us that he doesn't always drop into history and just change broken systems overnight, but he doesn't choose to ignore them either. He chooses to step into them and begin shaping them towards justice. And like I've said at the end of just about every video that we've done so far, if your claim requires that you ignore the textual evidence, and then requires that you ignore the historical evidence, and then requires that you ignore the scholarly evidence, and finally tells you that you must ignore the cultural evidence, then it's at least worth stepping back and asking yourself, how valid is my claim? So if you've made it this far, I'd really, really love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment down below. You don't have to agree with me. You can agree, you can disagree, or you could still be working through it. Because this series isn't and never was about shutting people down. Too many times that's the complaint I have most about skeptics is they want to shut the conversation down and they want to control the conversation. What this series is about is actually inviting people to join the conversation. For too long, people, and Christians included, have kind of avoided tough questions and tough issues. And if this video helped you see the passage maybe in a different light than what somebody else told you it meant, or even what you thought it meant, then please just take a second to move that little cursor down to the bottom of the video and hit that little thumbs up icon, because it really does help us get our content out to more people. And if you want to see more content like this, then please make sure to hit the subscribe button. That's the little icon that looks like a bell. I know I'm telling you a lot of things that you probably already know, but somebody told me earlier this week, never assume. So I'm trying my best to take that to heart. Now, in the coming weeks, we have a few more problematic Bible verses videos coming, and we're going to keep doing them exactly the way we've done this one, exposing the claim and uncovering the truth. So until next time, I'll see you in the next one. Hopefully. I don't want to assume.
We got just everything you need. We're here to take the lead.